Yeah, so I also know this is the last talk of the day, so thankfully there's lots of photos and pictures involved, so hopefully stimulate everyone and keep them awake. So maybe I'll just start off by these two phrases I have in the title of the talk, Space of Possible Minds and Landscapes. I'll actually set my timer. Landscapes of consciousness. I mean, space of possible minds for me, just kind of in a more metaphorical way, is always this, I kind of envisage that there's many, many different minds that likely exist in the universe. In some ways we can put these in spaces. They intersect in some ways, they overlap, and in some ways they don't. And in some ways you might have minds that don't intersect at all. And similarly, in terms of landscapes, all of these different minds perhaps have different types of landscapes of consciousness with different features, but thankfully we can probably map between landscapes and try and see which features map, which ones don't. So just to start off, this kind of, I think this term Umwelt, coined by Jacob von Uxel, the German biologist, is really kind of important one of a kind of the sensory experience of, or the sensory world of an individual organism, which is what we all live in, and which lots of other organisms also have their own particular Umwelt. And there's kind of a philosophical stance, I would say, towards what things are conscious. And I think, on one end, you could just assume, only yourself is conscious, or only humans, and you have to go proof case by case by case that every other thing is conscious, or else you can have the other way around, which is that you just assume everything is conscious. And my philosophical stance is really, I don't know. I think is probably the most obvious one. I don't know for sure, but I think having a lot of humility towards what is or isn't conscious is probably a good way to go forwards. So the first half of the presentation is going to kind of move through what I see as being different types of minds. And then the second half of the presentation is going to be discussing some mathematical concepts that I think are very useful for us to try to still look for similarities between these different types of minds. So the first types of minds I have is just human minds. I think even within human minds, there's actually a really, really broad diversity of conscious experience that's going on. Oftentimes, these things aren't even very obvious to us because they're kind of confined by the language that we use for one another. And so here's just a list of a variety of different conscious experiences that people have that sometimes diverge. And really, for the sake of this presentation, I'd maybe just try to imagine, maybe some people in here have various aspects of these, but in the case of you might have a chromatopsia where like everything is kind of in grayscale. And so I'd invite you to imagine that this is your conscious experience transformed. You see everything in grayscale. Hyperphantasia is when sometimes your visual imagination is as vivid as reality itself. So it's kind of overlaid on top of that. And neuralia is kind of been defined for where you have no inner dialogue, which for me would be very bizarre. And lexical gustatory synesthesia is where different words can actually have a taste. And so for me, when I try and put myself in the mind, if I happen to have all of these different variations, for me it feels like my moment-to-moment experience would actually be quite different. So another kind of type I'd say is natural selection minds, maybe you say neo-Darwinism minds, but essentially referring to all of the other biological organisms that we find on the planet Earth. And we have very large one. You have trees of life. This one happens to be a time tree of life, kind of classifying families of organisms going back for the last 4 billion years. And we categorize them, generally into different varieties by kingdoms, 5 or 6 kingdoms, depending where you are. And of course, we do that again with species. And we kind of, I think, at the level of species, we normally tend to think that there are similarities within species that kind of make them close to their conscious experiences to be close to one another. There's a fantastic book called An Immense World by Ed Yong, where he kind of goes through all of these different sensory worlds, the umwelts of these creatures. So I'm just going to run through quickly some of those. I mean, here, in terms of olfaction and your nose sense, dogs obviously have a very, very powerful sense of smell. They can actually kind of move through time, and ants can track pheromones. Elephants happen to use their nose for navigating and also actually picking things up. In terms of eyes, scallops actually have many eyes covering themselves, which was quite surprising. And the praying mantis shrimps have a very different visual system about how it functions. Taste receptors, a lot of insects actually have taste receptors all over on their legs, so when they land, they're tasting things. So it's kind of like if we were walking around and tasting things with every step. And Interestingly, the naked mole rats have a very high capacity pain tolerance for things that we would find very painful. They can handle. This is infrared, creatures that can use infrared. This is tactile sensations. So you have the star-nosed mole who's really nearly using his sense of touch as an eye to navigate in dark spaces where other organisms can't. This is to do with ripples, vibrations in the ground. Whales can do these kind of sonic auditory sounds sometimes across oceans that we think they traverse. There's echolocation in dolphins and bats. I think for me, one of the more interesting is electrical fields, so organisms that generate electrical fields to navigate the environment. I think particularly because electrical fields are things that we ourselves didn't know about, up until the last couple hundred years. So there are kind of aspects of the physical world that we weren't really aware of, but these organisms are utilizing them, which is very beautiful. And it actually happens that sharks actually don't generate electrical fields, but they can detect them by these little ampullae structures inside their heads. And we then have, some octopuses, which are just always fun to put in because they're kind of, they have some type of kind of autonomy in the different tentacles that they use. So digital minds, so these are obviously, you could also say artificial intelligent minds, but these are things that we're starting to develop across the world now. And I think, soon might populate society in many more numbers than we do. Who knows? And so just some of the things that I would see as them being different than us is, the first one is just speed. I think, microchips and circuits are functioning at a much faster rate than our biological neurons. And that is gonna, that in itself is already quite fascinating. I mean, if you think, even if it's 1,000 times quicker, the experience of living one day or living 1,000 days already becomes very, very significant. In terms of memory, obviously, in terms of working on long-term memory, they can have much larger storage capacities than us. They can also expand their storage capacities, so you can just go buy another 10 terabytes and attach it up. And modification, it could be possible that you can copy memories. Maybe you can copy them more directly, paste them. Maybe you can modify them by cutting out segments. And then sensory apparatus is quite interesting, especially for conscious experience. I think if they have incoming streams of data from cameras and auditory systems, which already belong to us, but they could be distributed across much greater spatial domains. But there's also all of these other sensory equipments that we build as physical systems, and it's interesting to wonder whether, if we do have digital minds that are having conscious experiences, do they have conscious experiences of all of these other type of sensory apparatus that we can build? Maybe even going things like radio telescopes or in very far future neutrinos. And then there's also the spatial variety that, those sensors can be put as deep down as the Mariana Trench, but also be up in outer space. And then in terms of embodiment, there's quite a big variety because we have, humanoid robots that are getting built. We have animal robots that are getting built. We have swarms of drones. We also have simulations. So there's inside, kind of inside computers, but you can simulate bodies for them. And we have underwater robots. We have robots that can go to other planets. And so all of these things might lead to quite different conscious experiences than we're used to. And then this idea of astrominds is really minds that we might find out in the cosmos. So we find ourselves here on a planet, and this planet seems to be in a fairly regular spiral galaxy in the universe. And the universe itself seems to contain hundreds of billions of these galaxies, maybe infinite, or too sure. At least it goes out to the edge of the observable universe. And so I think it seems relatively reasonable to imagine that there might be other entities out there. And with more recent work, we're kind of looking at things like Kepler planets and habitable planets and what that might mean. I mean, here on planet Earth, we tend to be kind of carbon-based life forms, and water is one of the main things that we use. But if you look at astrobiologists, I mean, they also hypothesize that we might have silicon-based life. Ammonia, which would be NH3, can also be perhaps used as a solvent instead of water. And so there may be other ways for life to develop, because even when we look at all of planet Earth, that's mostly, it's DNA based, and they've all developed here. And so there may be very big changes when life develops elsewhere on the planet. And just, lastly, I mean, my tendency is kind of, I quite like Douglas Adams' in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where he refers to a very intelligent shade of blue. I don't really know what's out there, but I like the idea to be open that maybe there is, yeah, super intelligent shades of blue out in the universe. And then lastly, just kind of more exotic minds, which at least have been posited by people. And kind of the first one I would just say is kind of spirits. These are things that have been kind of been referenced, I think, throughout history in different mythologies and religions, and they come in the form of, fairies or elves or gnomes or angels and demons. And I think even if you think they're just limited to the imagination of ourselves, it's at least interesting that human minds tend to constantly create other minds that we perceive to have different conscious experiences. There's also this notion of chimeras, and chimeras previously, for instance, in this top picture in Greek mythology, would have been a fusion of multiple organisms together, something that we probably would have used to think was limited to our imagination. But in more modern eras, we see here this Bizarria fruit of Florentine, which is a mixture of a lemon and lime. And then we have these goat sheep chimeras where you actually fused embryos together. And similarly down the bottom, they actually are mice rat, where we fused embryos together. So we're kind of seeing this change from what was imagination into reality. More recently, there's people who talk about DMT entities within psychedelic trips that people constantly see. Organoids are kind of small brains that are being developed in systems. Xenobots are very strange, which are essentially reformulated skin cells from frogs that often actually now are exhibiting behavior. And cyborgs, which is essentially us getting more and more integrated and connected with technology, and people are doing that in a variety of ways. So yeah, basically, to me, it seems like there is a very, very large space of possible minds. And the kind of question is, what can we say about all of those? And I think it's reasonable to assume that at the very least, there will probably be in their experience some type of structure, some type of pattern, some relationships between these that change over time. And it happens that, even though that sounds quite vague, mathematics is very good at describing these abstract notions. So in the mathematical frameworks, so yeah, the first thing that I'd like to talk about is just maybe the notion of sets, and how I find this quite a useful way to think about it. So in terms of sets of experience, we kind of have maybe a set of all conscious experience. So all the types of minds that we can envisage, if we can put all of their experiences that they have into one gigantic set, and then you can have possible conscious experiences. And so, for instance, it might be that different species of minds are only able to have certain conscious experiences. I mean, I'm not an octopus, I don't have 8 tentacles, so it's quite hard for me to have the experience of using those to navigate the environment. Similarly, then within that, there's actually the lived conscious experiences, because although there's a great variety of possible ones we do only live a single one. And then we have this current experience that's going on, kind of as the element of this set. So there, you can also look at this in two ways. You can kind of look at it as like, the possible conscious experience. Maybe a species has more possible conscious experience than the actual individual within it, considering their condition in the environment and everything. So there's a kind of a beautiful paper by Johannes Kleiner and Tim Ludwig that they just published that I'd highly recommend reading, called What is a Mathematical Structure of Conscious Experience? And it kind of relates a lot to what I'm about to say, so I'll just introduce their notation. The idea is that every experience, to every experience, there are aspects to the experience, and you can represent that as a set. And these aspects of the experience, we can also imagine another experience, maybe the moment after what's occurring, that also has aspects. And joining them up is a variation, so you can say there's a variation between one set of aspects of experience to the other. Now, we say that this variation is a partial mapping, because it doesn't necessarily map every aspect of your experience. Some of your aspects of experience might just disappear. You don't have them anymore. And then it's also not surjective, because it allows for new aspects to arise that aren't necessarily mapped from the previous moment. So I think it's a very useful way to describe it. And the other thing that I'll just go through is that you can also define how to preserve a structure in conscious experience. And so between those two sets, the variation may or may not preserve structure. So the concept I want to talk about is isomorphisms, which I think are brought up a lot, but I think they're really, really useful for consciousness studies as a whole. And there's a few different ways of defining these. I think, the most straightforward way is that we have a mapping between two sets, which is in inverse and maps back to itself. Why this is so interesting is it actually occurs all of the time in our conscious experiences, or we at least implicitly assume that it's happening all of the time. So here we have kind of 6 images. It's an interesting question to ask, are they the same image? I think the answer would normally be yes, but no. And of course, what we really mean is that we know they're the same, but we know that the colors are different. And so they're isomorphic to one another, except the difference is in their colors. And that seems quite obvious. You can put on and off sunglasses and you can experience this. You could also do it spatially, though. We can actually warp images, and we have mappings that can warp those images and invert them back to themselves. And so what's interesting here is that these things that appear maybe even more differently can also be isomorphic to one another. So this concept of an isomorphism, what I'm going to try and do now is kind of connect the sets aspects of experience to this concept of an isomorphism. So here you might imagine that you have a person in mind that's just watching a tree, and that kind of outer set is the aspects of all of their experience, and the TA is the aspects which relate to the tree. And then there's a variation in the external environment. So a branch breaks, and there will also be a variation in that person's internal experience of what the aspects of the tree are. What's interesting is if you add in another mind who's standing beside the person, and we assume that they're experiencing the same tree, and so they'll also have this TB, this aspects to their tree. There'll be a variation for them as well. Now, what I think we nearly always implicitly assume is that there is an isomorphism occurring between our minds. So, there's some subset of our experiences that will map to the other person's experience exactly. Now, we normally always assume that there is going to be some changes. Maybe someone perceives color a little bit differently. Maybe someone hears things a little differently. But I think there's always an implicit assumption in order for us to communicate with one another that there are always these isomorphic subsets between minds. And also that, when the tree is there and then when the branch breaks, you can instead look to the other person and you assume that the same thing has occurred in their mind. So I think this is very powerful because, one, it's like a formal way of discussing something that is probably ongoing all of the time, and it kind of gives room for the variance in our conscious experience while also defining what things are actually the same. And what's interesting maybe in relation to the first half of the talk in this big space of possible minds and things that are more different than another human is that I think the same kind of formal framework also works for other animals. And so you could also have like two dogs standing there perceiving some object, and we would normally assume that when something happens that for the dogs there's also an isomorphism between their minds, which continues on. And I think even more interestingly, even though it wouldn't be the same maybe set as me and another human or you and another human, if you were beside another animal, I think what gets very interesting is to wonder what are the isomorphic sets between those minds? Because if we're both perceiving the same external world and we kind of assume that the structures that are being generated in our conscious experience are related to the structures out in the external world, then we should also assume that even between us and other animals, there are these isomorphic mappings going on. And I think they kind of provide, at least for me, they provide very interesting analysis of kind of what these underlying structures are. So, I mean, this top picture with the tree and the things, you can, in some way, I think what's often being assumed is that there is an external world out there and that we're mapping some structure from that external world into our minds, and that then when there's a variation in the external structure of the world, that's being mapped into our minds. And I think a lot of the stuff we kind of assume normally, and I'd love to say if people don't agree with this, I also think that's fantastic, because I would like to understand why they don't agree. This is just, as far as I can see, seems to be how we normally go about things. So I mean, eventually, I think what would be interesting is that these notions of isomorphisms, there are probably subsets across lots of different minds that might be preserved. And so what's interesting to me is to kind of try and figure out what those subsets of the aspects of experience are preserved across many, many different minds. And then, that's kind of a phenomenological question, because even though they might perceive things differently, if the underlying structure is preserved, that's actually what we normally care about. And if you kind of stretch this a little bit further onto kind of an ontology, really what we're also wondering, okay, is what are the things that we're directly taking from an external world and what are just being internally generated? Because there are aspects of experience which we normally assume stem from an external world, but there's perhaps also aspects of experience that we think are internally generated. You know, when you close your eyes or if you dream or if you do these things, we don't always assume that's coming from outside information. Yeah, so just to finish up that section, I think there's the sets of experiences. We have variations in experiences that we can map as through that. There's these examples that we're all very used to of how we can see things as being nearly the same but different. And I kind of think that by further developing this, that hopefully it will kind of work as a way to try to find understandings of how different minds perceive things differently but the same. So yeah, just in general, just want to acknowledging the richness and diversity of minds that exist. I think that will help us to develop a field of consciousness science that has general principles. And I think mathematics can provide conceptual frameworks that allow us to talk about these abstract structures and relationships and everything else across the space of possible minds. So thank you for listening.